Hello, well, welcome everyone to our October Wednesday webinar. Today's webinar is on what you need to know to help students file the FAFSA. So we're so glad that you're here with us today. I'm Mila Tappan. I'm the Manager of College Access and Outreach at the Finance Authority of Maine. And with me today is the fabulous Maria McDougall. Maria, do you have just a quick second to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Maria McDougall, and I'm one of the college access counselors here at FAME, and this is Ophelia, and she likes to sit on my desk. So if I suddenly disappear, it's because she sat on the keyboard, and I'm happy to help answer all your FAFSA questions. So chat or Q&A is fine, and thank you for being here today.
Great. And thank you, Maria, for driving the train behind us. I appreciate that very much. And so what we'll do throughout the presentation is I'll stop periodically to see what questions are being asked, and we'll answer as many as we can during this session. And whatever we don't get answered during the session, I will follow up and send you an email with those questions and answers within the week. We'll share the link to the video as well. So today's session is geared towards counselors and access professionals, because we're going to discuss a whole variety of circumstances. So we're going to go a little bit more into the weeds than we would if we were having a session specifically for students and parents. If you are a parent, we're thrilled to have you here. It's great to have you joining us for any of our webinars. You're always welcome, but do know that if you're filing a FAFSA for your student, you will not find it as difficult as it might seem today based on what we're going to talk about, because we are going to talk about some of those more difficult, challenging, complicated situations. So that we're thrilled that you're here, but don't panic. Your FAFSA is likely going to be much easier to complete. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to kind of break the presentation into two parts, although they're not equal. The first part is much quicker than the second part. So first we're going to talk about the FSA ID, and then next we're going to talk about the FAFSA itself and filing the FAFSA. But first, let's start talking about the FSA ID. So many of you are very familiar, I'm sure, with the FSA ID. FSA stands for Federal Student Aid. And so every student needs to have an FSA ID of their own, because that is how they're going to access all of the federal student aid websites. First and foremost, the FAFSA, but everything else that's federal student aid related, including things like signing master promissory notes if they decide that they're going to borrow any federal student loans. Additionally, if the student is going to be considered dependent, we're going to talk about that as we go through the FAFSA, then one parent will need an FSA ID so that they can sign the FAFSA as a parent. They will also need that FSA ID if they're going to use the IRS data retrieval tool, which we're going to talk about that too in a moment, and we really want people to use those tools. So every student needs one, and one parent, if the student is dependent, needs to have an FSA ID as well. Now, FSA IDs are tied to an individual social security number, and why that is such a big deal is because we only have one social security number. So if we lose track of the information connected with the FSA ID, we can't just start over and create a new one. We have to kind of figure out what the underlying information was. Because of that, we want people to be sure that they're writing down the important information related to their FSA IDs. So specifically username, password, challenge questions, and we have a form for that. So Maria is going to drop in the chat our FSA ID information tracking form, and we would love to have people use that. Now, we know not everyone has access to print off materials, so if you don't have access to print it off, that's no problem at all, but we just recommend that people make sure that that information is documented somewhere, because students are going to need their FSA ID for years to come. And so it's one thing for them to have it now, but when they go to use it a year from now, we want to be sure that they have access to it. But it is information that they want to keep confidential. So if they're going to write it down on a piece of paper, keep it in the same location as you would something like a tax return. Another idea is to take a picture of it, write it down, take a picture of it so it's on the student's phone, but only do that if your student is locking their phone and not a phone that people have access to that shouldn't. So we do recommend getting FSA IDs ahead of time. We think that's the better way to go when possible, because we're big fans of breaking things into chunks. It makes things not seem so overwhelming. And if there is any issues with creating the FSA ID, it's nice to get that done ahead of time separate from the FAFSA. but the student can certainly get their FSA ID as the first step when they're doing a FAFSA in a given evening, and we'll talk about that in a moment. One of the reasons we're going to talk a little bit more about the FSA ID than we might have otherwise is because there's a new site where students can get their FSA ID. Now, the old site, fsaid.ed.gov, still exists, but we're pretty sure, not any more clear than we were before this morning, though, even though both of us listened to a federal student aid webinar today, we're pretty sure at some point that FSA ID site is going to go away. So we are directing people now to the studentaid.gov site to create their FSA ID. And actually within the FAFSA, if people need to connect to anything related to their FSA ID, the FAFSA is sending them here too, which is why we think the other site's going to go away. So we like this site. We think this is a better place anyway. It's more user-friendly. So everyone who needs to create an FSA ID or has already created one and wants to check on it, you go to studentaid.gov and click on Create Account. Once you're in that, it's going to look like this. So more white space, again, much more user-friendly. Students will indicate that they either want to log in or create an account, but let's just say this is a situation where a student doesn't have their FSA ID yet. They're going to go and create one. It's going to tell them what they need it for. So I think this is really important because it does emphasize that it's not just for the FAFSA, even though that's super important, that they're going to need this for years to come for all sorts of different reasons. And it tells them, again, what they need in advance in order to be able to create their FSA ID. So that, we think, is helpful. So the first step is they're going to provide their personal information. They're going to provide their name, their date of birth, and their social security number. And this is a flip from the old site. The old site, they used to create their username and password first, and then they'd provide their personal information. And sometimes they'd realize they actually already had an FSA ID. So the way that they're doing it now, that's going to show up quicker. If they indeed do have one, they're going to know it right as a result of filing, putting in information on this first screen. So most people will be fine. They'll just enter in this information. And then on the next slide is where they're going to create their username and put in their password. And this is where they're also going to provide their email address. Now, as has always been the case, only one email address can be associated with an FSA ID. So everyone who has an FSA ID has to have their own email address. It can't be one that's been used previously. So in some situations, students need to go create, or parents may need to go create a new email account. They certainly can set up a Gmail account, and that's really easy to do. So we recommend doing that. Additionally, we recommend that students do not use their school email address when setting up this account. And that's because, as we've mentioned, this account is going to be with them for years to come. And having access to the email is important. But once they graduate from high school, likely their high school email address is going to be gone. So this is a perfect time, if students haven't done so already, to create a Gmail account or some other generic account that they will use ongoingly as they transition from high school to college to the workforce, that they have that separate personal email address. The next thing that they're going to do is they're going to provide contact information. So again, this is pretty straightforward, and they probably won't have any difficulty doing that until they get to the phone number. Now, one of the things that we're noticing, especially with people who have track phones, is sometimes when they enter in the mobile phone number, they're getting a message that says that phone number is already associated with an FSA ID. So just like the email address has to be unique, and there can only be one out there, so is the same as the case with a mobile phone number. If it's already in use and associated with an FSA ID, you cannot use that mobile phone number again. So what we recommend when this happens is that the student simply, or the parent or whoever it might be, simply blank out the mobile phone number. Students have to have either an email address or a mobile phone number, but they don't have to have both. So if the mobile phone number is already in use, they can simply blank this out and hit next, and they still should be able to create their FSA ID with no issues. We really, really recommend that if they have put in a mobile phone number that they can use, we want them to, if they have one that's not already in use, please do use that, and please do set it up so they can use it for account recovery. As much as we say to people, write things down, take a picture of it, All of us have lost usernames and passwords at some point, and being able to retrieve that information, retrieve usernames, reset passwords using the phone is going to make it much easier down the road when 2, 3, 4 years from now, they can't remember this information. It happens to everyone. So setting up all of these precautions ahead of time is going to make everything easier. Next, they're going to select their communication preferences. So they can either say by email or postal mail. Obviously, I think email is probably going to work better for most people. And then they're going to do their challenge questions. So I know it's kind of getting small here, but they're still going to do what they did in the past, which is they have 4 challenge questions that they need to set up. They can select from the drop-down box, and they can put in the answers to those questions. Now, one of the things that we recommend all the way through creating this process is you might be able to see here where it says, you know, with the answer, it says show answer, is to click on that to be sure that what they've typed in is what they meant to type in. So I've got a keyboard at the moment that's got a sticky key. So I want to be sure that when I type something in, it's what I meant to type in. So by showing the answer, and that's again at several points in this process, we want them to do that so that they're sure that it's matching what their intentions are. So that they don't write down something that wasn't actually what got entered. The next step, we're already at 6 of 7, is that they're going to confirm and verify their information. I did not print off this whole screen, but basically they're just going to see everything they've already provided so that they can make sure it's correct. If they did make a mistake and they needed to correct something, they can edit it right there. And then last but not least, and incredibly important, is they're going to verify their mobile phone and their email address. And in the perfect world, we want people to use both a mobile phone and an email address. That's the best case scenario. And when they get to this screen, what they're going to do is they're going to click on the icon. So if they start with the cell phone icon, it's going to pop up this other screen over here where it says verify your mobile phone number. And what's happening is when they click on that icon, they're going to get a text. And in their text, they're going to get a secure code. So they're going to get a number that they are then going to come right back here immediately, and they're going to enter that secure code into this box right here. And then they're going to click continue. And the purpose of that is that verifies the fact that they are in possession of that cell phone, that mobile phone. And so therefore, the feds feel like then they can communicate with the student and use that process to reset passwords or to retrieve usernames. Same thing with the email address. So once they've done the mobile phone, they're going to click on this icon. They're going to get an email. So you want to make sure that students have access to their email when they're setting up their FSA ID. In that email, they're going to get a different secure code. They're going to enter that in the box here, and then they're going to click continue. And that again verifies that they have access to that email account. So this usually works pretty smoothly. We have been seeing that it's taking a little bit for emails to come. I wouldn't say a long time, but a couple of minutes in some cases. So just try to hold tight. You can have a secure code resent, but the student needs to have access to their phone and their email while they're setting this up, because that code is only valid for 30 minutes. And without entering those codes, they are unable to continue. And then they're done. And so I didn't bother to put in the congratulations screen, but there's a congratulations screen that follows that. So then they have set up their FSA ID and it's ready to use immediately. Now, if you're looking for some additional information on the FSA ID creation process, or if you want to share it with students, we have some great videos. So Maria and the team are just amazing in these animated videos they've set up. They're short, they're very accessible. So we would love to have you check them out. We have these videos and a whole bunch of informational videos on the link that's listed here on the slide. So we have the Create Your FSA ID one, but then one of our newer ones is What the Heck is Wrong with My FSA ID? And this is the one where if you've got a student or a parent who has an FSA ID but can't figure it out, they know they've got to unravel it. As I said, they can't just redo a new one because it's associated with their social security number. This will walk people through the steps of trying to figure out how to unravel all that so they can reset and retrieve the necessary information in order to be able to use their FSA ID. All right, Maria, I'll take a quick break and see, do we have any FSA ID questions that we should address before moving on?
I jumped the gun and put the links to those videos directly in the chat before we got to that slide. But Also, we just, one clarifying question about student and parent needing their own FSA IDs. And I just wanted to jump in and say that if the parent already has one, whether they did it for themselves because they went to college or they did it for an older child, it's theirs, and they're probably in the what the heck is my FSA ID territory of videos if they need to figure out what that was. So just a clarifying question there, but otherwise, nothing else.
Okay, yeah. So think of it as it's tied to your social. So whether I'm Mila, the student, or I'm Mila, the parent, I'm Mila and I have the same social security number. So I'm going to use that same username and password for whatever task I'm trying to complete that's FSA ID related. But yeah, lots of parents out there who had one for their older sibling, because probably the older sibling created it for the parent. And so the parents didn't even realize it. So that's why it's the best case scenario. The student can create theirs, the parent can create theirs. That's the perfect world scenario. Might not be reality, but there are some benefits to that. All right, so now let's move on and actually talk about the FAFSA. So as we get started today, one of the things I do want to note is that there aren't significant changes to the FAFSA this year. So that's really good. There are a couple, and I saw in the questions, people did ask if I was going to be sure to point out what's new, and I will as we go through today. But much of it's going to look very familiar. There's been some reorganization. But hopefully most of this is going to look really familiar, and today is going to be more validating of what you already know, and we'll go a little bit deeper into some of the more complicated situations. So we're not going to touch on every single question. So when starting the FAFSA, you can go to FAFSA.gov and you can click on Start Here. Now, when you're coming back after you've started a FAFSA or in subsequent years, you can click on Returning User. But I'm gonna tell you a secret. They both take you to the exact same place. I just double checked it today to make sure, and they do exactly the same thing. So don't get really hung up on whether it's Start Here or Log In. They both take you to the same location. So once you've clicked on that, you then are gonna log into the FAFSA. Now, what it's gonna default to is a screen that looks like this. Excuse me, it doesn't default, but we want you to click on I am the student. So when the student is starting their FAFSA, because keep in mind, the FAFSA is a student application. The student is the one that's applying for financial aid, even though for many students, parent information is required. The student is the applicant. But in reality, even if the parent is starting the FAFSA, I'm going to confess on this one. I started Noah's. I clicked on I am the student, and I put in Noah's information. Okay, so this is the best way to start it, is to click on I am the student. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put in the student's username and password. And be careful when you put those in. This unfortunately does not have the show text piece. So just type it in carefully, because you do only have so many attempts before you'll get locked out of your account. So want to take it nice and slow on that one. Students can use either their username to sign in, or a verified email address also works. Even a verified cell phone number is said to work. I've not tried it. It doesn't say it here, but in other information that I saw just today, the feds say it works. So, so you could try any of the three of those. If the student doesn't have an FSA ID yet, they can simply click on Create One. So let's just say the students attending an event of ours tonight, they have no idea about the FAFSA. The first thing we're going to have them do is we're going to have them log in. They say, I don't have an FSA ID yet. No problem. We're going to say, click on Create One. It's going to take them to that FSA ID site that we just showed you. They're going to create their FSA ID, and then they're going to come back here and be able to use it immediately. Okay. Later on in the process, we're going to talk about what parents do. So students are going to put in their FSA ID information, and then they're going to see this slide. And so we want to be sure that students are selecting the correct year of the FAFSA to file. So if you are working with high school seniors, they need to be completing the 21-22 FAFSA, because students, I know it seems really early, but students are applying for financial aid for next academic year. The FAFSA that just became available will cover next academic year. So that's the 21-22 FAFSA. Now the 2021 FAFSA does still exist. Believe it or not, we have college students out there who are currently enrolled or maybe intending to enroll in the spring semester, and they haven't done a FAFSA yet. So it actually is not too late to file a FAFSA even for the current year. We don't recommend that. We recommend that students file as early as possible, but it is still okay to apply for financial aid currently. But most of the students that we're working with right now are doing the 21-22 FAFSA. The next step is to create a save key. So you might be thinking, what's a save key? Well, we just talked about the FSA ID and usernames and passwords. Well, the save key is just a temporary password. It is meant to be what the student will enter if they have a partially completed FAFSA that has not yet been submitted and they need to get back into it. So many times students are going to sit down and they're going to finish the FAFSA all in one fell swoop. They will never need this save key. But let's just say that there's a hiccup in the system and they get logged out inadvertently. Let's just say that someone shows up at their front door and they need to go deal with that immediately. They can save the FAFSA. It's supposed to save as they go, but we always want them to click on save before they leave the FAFSA. And then they can come back in, put in their FSA ID, username and password, but this save key will allow them to get back in and to pick up right where they left off, okay? So it is just temporary. Once the FAFSA is submitted, that save key is gone and they will not need that again. If they have come back in the future, they'll create a new save key. So as we mentioned a moment ago, the FAFSA is a student application. So knowing that going into this process makes all of the questions make a little bit more sense. So the first half is really about the student. I think the best case scenario is for the student to be kind of driving the process and to do the first half of the FAFSA themselves, and then have the parent pick up and complete the second half of the FAFSA, where typically most of the parent information is going to be required. So what the student is going to do is they're going to provide their demographic information here. The good news is they signed in with their FSA ID, so much of this information is going to be pre-filled for them. It's going to been pulled over from the FSA ID. So that's going to be really easy. They do want to just double check that the information was correct though. Now, a couple other things that I want to point out on this particular screen is you can see the sections of the FAFSA. There are 7 sections to the FAFSA, and you can kind of see where you are. Now, with the FAFSA, you cannot skip over a section. So built into the FAFSA is something called skip logic. And so it takes how people answer questions to determine what questions need to be asked of them in the future. So in order to make sure that people are only having to answer the questions that are necessary for their situation, they have to answer the questions initially in sequence. So they can't skip a section. Now, once they have completed a section, they can go backwards though, okay? So once they're all the way through the FAFSA, they can jump around all they want, but when they're initially completing it, they do have to go in order. Now, when you are working with a student to complete the FAFSA, and if there's a question about a question, you can always click on this question mark here. And this will provide more information about what that question is looking for. Okay, so that's a great way to get some additional information. And last but not least on this particular screen, I want to highlight the previous and the next keys. When you're in the FAFSA, be sure that you use those keys to navigate the FAFSA. You don't want to use your browser arrows. When you use your browser back arrows, and gosh knows I've done it a whole bunch of times over the years, it will cause an issue and you'll have to log back in and everything. So always be sure to use the previous and the next keys. So as we continue in the student demographics section, as you can see here, these screens are going to be pretty easy. The student's going to have put in their email and their phone number. They're then going to put in their address. So that's pretty straightforward. And again, some of this is already going to be pre-filled for many students. They are then going to provide information on their residency, and their eligibility will be determined based on that. So they're going to indicate whether they've lived in a particular state, because they've already entered that for at least 5 years. And then they're going to be asked if they're a US citizen. So if they're a US citizen, they're just going to say yes. Other options that exist in this dropdown is that they're an eligible non-citizen. And then the third category is they're not an eligible non-citizen. They're a non-citizen who's not eligible. So if a student is an eligible non-citizen, and again, click on that arrow and you can see all of the criteria that determines whether or not a student is an eligible non-citizen. If they are that category, then what's going to happen is the screen's going to update and they're going to be asked to put in their alien registration number. So again, another example of that skip logic. But if they enter that they're a US citizen, they'll just go ahead and click on next. And then they're going to be in the student education section. So a couple of things I want to highlight on this screen. So it asks, what will your high school completion status be at the end of the 2021 year? Now, one thing that I picked up today is I'm using a screen grab from the feds, and this really should say 21-22. And I apologize that I didn't notice this until just before, an hour before, because I thought all of their screens were for the correct year. So what the student is actually going to see when they're doing this live is the 21-22 school year, okay? So what the student also wants to be sure of is that if they do have a high school diploma, that they indicate that. But if they are a student who is homeschooled, that's going to be a drop-down option. If they are an adult who's returning to school that maybe didn't graduate from high school, but instead got a high set or got a GED, they're going to indicate that. So those options do exist there as well. Next, it asks, what college degree or certificate will you be working on? And here, one of the questions that we get often is, if I'm going to be pursuing a bachelor's, but maybe an associate's, and I'm not really sure, I recommend putting in that you're pursuing a bachelor's degree if you think that's at all a possibility. But one of the things that we see sometimes is students want to realize that if they're a high school senior, they're not working on a graduate degree. We get that question a lot. And a lot of times they inadvertently think that they're working on a graduate degree when they're not. Right out of high school, they're working either on their first bachelor's or an associate's degree. And then one more question I just want to highlight down here is, what will your college grade level be when you begin next year? And we get a lot of questions about students who are dual enrollment, taking dual enrollment classes or have college classes going into their first year in college. Even if they have some college credits, even if they have some credits that they've been earning through dual enrollment, they're still going to indicate that they are a never attended first year student. And that's because for federal financial aid purposes, they are going to be a never attended first year college student, because as a high school student, they were not eligible to get federal financial aid funds. So even if they're bringing in college credits with them, they still want to indicate never attended college first year. And then actually, I'm going to say one thing about work study. Maria and I want this question gone off the FAFSA, but no one's listened to us so far. We want students to indicate yes if they are answering that question, even if they don't know what work study is, even if they don't know if they want work study, even if they think they don't want work study. We want them to say yes, because later on down the line, if they're offered work study and they don't want it, they can always reject it later. But up front, we'd like to have them considered for that. So please have them answer yes to that question. Now on this screen, it talks about selective service registration. So we were doing an event last night and we had a mom who was not happy at all to learn that her son has to be registered with a selective service in order to be eligible for federal financial aid funds, but that still is the reality. So the students are going to be asked whether they're male or female. And just to be clear, it's male or female at the time, at their birth. So when they were born and when their social security numbers were issued, were they male or female? So if you are working with transgender students, we know that that's not how they want to answer that question, but for now, they do have to answer it in that way. So if they're female, they won't see the rest of the questions on the screen. The skip logic, again, is going to prevent them from even seeing it. But if they're male, they're going to be asked if they've registered with the selective service. If they have already, indicate yes. If they haven't, indicate no. And then it's going to ask, do they want us, meaning the federal government, to register them with the selective service? So if the student is already 18 and they have not registered with selective service, click yes to that. And then what's going to happen is that they will automatically register the student with the selective service. So that's just one thing the student doesn't have to do separately. So that makes it easier, okay? But there is a window. If you click it too much before a student's birthday, I think it's a 30-day window. I've never been able to find this in writing. I'm just doing it from memory, that it's a 30-day window. So if the student's birthday is more than 30, if the student's 17 and not turning 18 sooner than in a month or so, this won't work for them, okay? This works really well for students who are already 18, who have not registered for selective service. They want to indicate yes, and then automatically they will be registered with the selective service. Driver's license number, if a student has one, they should put it in. If they don't have a driver's license, they certainly don't need to put it in. If they do have a driver's license and they can't locate it, they can skip this question. They will need to provide it if they do end up borrowing a federal student loan, though, but they'll do that through a separate process. So don't let this question hold the student up. And then getting to the end of this particular section, the next thing they're going to do is indicate whether they're in foster care or have ever been in foster care, and that's so they can get provided with some additional information. And they're going to indicate the highest level of schooling completed by their parents. And this is meant to be referring to their biological parents. So this is the one place where how we talk about parents is different than we're going to talk about them in the parents section. Here they're looking for the two biological parents. What level of schooling did they complete? Here in Maine, we don't use that to award any types of aid. There are some states that are trying to identify who's a first-generation college student, and they're using this question to do it. We don't in Maine, but just answer it still to the best of the student's ability. All right, next, what we're going to do is the student is going to put in their high school. Now, the student is going to put in their high school if they indicated that they're going to have a high school diploma. If they indicated that they were homeschooled or they have a GED or they got their high set, they will never see this question. But for many of your students, they are going to have a high school diploma. So here is where they're going to put in their high school information. So they're simply going to put in the name, the city, and the state. They're going to click on search, and it's going to find their high school for them. After that, they're going to search for their college. And what we mean by that is here's where they want to identify all of the colleges that they want to receive this FAFSA information. Students do need to list at least one college on the FAFSA, so you do have to put at least one. You can't skip this whole section. So if you have a student who hasn't even started thinking about where they're applying yet, just have them pick one school and put it on there, a school that they think might be a possibility. The reality is if they put a school on here that they never apply to, it's no big deal. The schools just will never do anything with that data, so that's not a problem. Students can put up to 10 schools in this particular section. So hopefully students, we like to have students apply to more than 1 or 2 schools, maybe 4 or so, so they have some great options available to them. We do get concerned when students are applying to more than 10 schools, especially if they're ever selected for verification. That's going to be a really difficult process to navigate. But if students do want to have this information sent to more than 10 schools, what they will do is they will put their 10 schools, and I'm going to explain how they're going to do that. They're going to put their 10 schools on the FAFSA. They're going to submit their FAFSA and let it be processed, and then they will come back into their FAFSA and they'll make a correction, and they'll delete a couple of schools, however many they need to, in order to add those additional schools that they weren't able to put on there the first time. We recommend when they're trying to decide which schools to put on first, to put on the schools that they're most interested in, most likely to attend if offered admission, and the schools that have the earliest deadline. So that's kind of how they would determine which ones. So once they've got their list in front of them, then what they're going to do here is they are going to indicate which schools they want to have the information sent to. If they know the school code, they can click on yes, and they can enter that most of the time, except for Orono. I certainly don't know any of the other school codes, but if you do, some schools send that information out and the student has that handy, so that's one option. Most of the time, what they're going to do is they're going to do a search for it. So they do have to put in the state. And in Maine, they could just see all the schools in Maine if they knew they were only looking at Maine schools. Or they can put in the city or the school name as well to narrow that search a little bit. Once they click on search, what they are going to see is they're going to find their search results. So in this case, if it was just one school that met that criteria, they're only going to see one school. And what if I do Bangor, sometimes, for example, 3 schools come up. And so then they're going to click on, in the box here, the school that they want to add to the list. Then they can continue to search for schools by clicking on add more schools. Okay, so they continue to do that until they've added all of the schools that they want to have on their FAFSA so that they receive that information. The next question that they're going to see is that for each of the schools that they've listed, they are going to need to answer the housing question. So they're going to have 3 choices. Are they planning to live on campus, off campus, or with parents? So I would say that students want to do what they hope they can do. So if they want to live on campus, if they're not sure they're going to be able to, indicate that they're planning to live on campus. I would not have them list that they're going to be living with their parents unless they're absolutely positive that they're going to be living with their parents, because when the schools offer them financial aid, they're going to base it on the fact that they're living at home. What many students sometimes are doing is they want to see what the maximum amount of financial aid is that they can receive, and then they can make a determination of whether or not they can live on campus or off campus, or they need to live at home with their parents. Now, if they initially indicate that they're going to live on campus and then they decide to live at home, they do need to follow up with that particular school though, okay? But in the beginning, have them indicate what they're hoping for, and so that they can see what all of their options would actually be. Now we're actually in the dependency status section. And so there are 11 questions that determine whether or not a student is considered to be independent or dependent. If a student can answer yes to any one of those 11 questions, they are automatically going to be considered independent, meaning they don't have to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So they've actually already answered 2 of them by the time we get to this point. The first one is, are you 24? And so they've already provided their date of birth. And the other is if you're in graduate school. If you have gotten your bachelor's degree and you're now in graduate school, you are automatically considered to be independent. The next question is, what is your marital status? So if a student is married, the student is automatically going to be considered independent. Most of our high school seniors are not though, so they're going to be indicating that they're single. And then they're going to continue to see these dependency status questions. So the next set have to do with dependence. So the first question is, do you or will you have children who receive more than half of their support from you during the award year period? So if we have students, so let's just say we've got students who they're not 24, they're not married, but they do have children of their own, then the question becomes, do they provide more than half their support? So what you really need to do, and we get so personal so quickly with students, don't we, sometimes, we need to understand probably what their living situation is. If the student is living with her parents, let's say, and her parents are putting the roof over the head and providing food, and maybe, you know, grandmother's providing childcare, everything like that, it's probably unlikely that that student is providing half support for her own child, okay? But if you have a student that has an apartment and is taking care of that child, probably it's likely that the student is providing more than half support. When a student is determining whether or not they're providing half support, they are able to count any benefits that they receive on behalf of that child. So they can count subsidized housing, they can count TANF, they can count SNAP, they can count child care subsidies. So in that situation, that student would be able to say yes, that they're providing more than half support to their child. Now, if a student is pregnant, she is also going to answer yes to this question. Even if she hasn't had the baby yet, if she's expecting, she would answer yes to that question. Now, the second question here is really very similar, except that it's not asking about children, and spouses are always excluded from this question. It's asking, you know, do you have other people who live with you who receive more than half of their support from you? So an example of this, I had a student years ago who she was 19, but her mother lived with her. And so this student took care of her mother and provided more than her half support for her mother. So the student paid the rent, the student bought the groceries, and covered almost all of the expenses. Mom did have a little bit of Social Security, but not even half of it, and not even enough to provide half of her own expenses. So because that student provided more than half support to her mother, she could answer yes to this question. We also have sometimes students who have younger siblings living with them, and they're providing more than half their support. So those are some examples of when someone would answer yes to that. And I will take a break after the dependency questions here so we can see what questions you guys have for all of us. And then you're going to see some of the remaining questions. It asks if you are currently on active duty for purposes other than training. If the answer is yes, you'd be automatically considered independent. If you're a veteran of the armed forces, it's going to be a yes as long as you are honorably discharged. If at any time since turning 13, the student's parents are deceased, or the student was in foster care, or was a ward or dependent of the court, the student's going to indicate, check that off, and they're going to be considered independent. If the student is an emancipated minor, they're going to be considered independent. If the student is in the legal guardianship of someone other than their parents or their step-parents, and that was determined by a court in their state, then they are going to check yes, and they're automatically going to be considered independent. We see this a ton. We see that there are a whole bunch of family members out there, grandparents in particular, who have legal guardianship of their grandchild. So because they have legal guardianship, the student can click yes to that, and the student is going to be considered independent for purposes of filing the FAFSA, and no parent information is going to be required on the FAFSA at all. If the student did not check yes to any of those, they're going to check on none of the above. And they're going to see the one final dependency related question. And that's about homelessness. So the question that they would see at this point is on or after July 1 of 2020, and that date is correct. So what we're looking at now is for students who are filing FAFSAs currently, anytime since this past July 1st, if they were homeless or were self-supporting and at risk of being homeless, they would indicate yes if that was their situation. So at any time, even if they're not currently, if at any time they were in that situation, they should indicate yes. The next screen that they are going to see is this one that basically is asking who can verify that that's your status. So is there someone out there that can indicate that you are considered to be homeless or at self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So for high school students who are homeless, this is usually a fairly straightforward process because often their high school or their school district homeless liaison already has documented that. And so the student would just indicate that yes to that. And then if the college ever needs documentation of that fact, their high school district liaison can provide that documentation. So those students are usually pretty well set for that first year that they're filing the FAFSA. Other people who can document that are directors of an emergency homeless shelter or traditional housing program funded by HUD, or director of a runaway or homeless youth basic center. Any of those can provide that. So if they can check yes to any one of those three, then they're going to be able to be considered independent. Again, their college might want documentation of that, but they're going to be considered independent. Now, one of the things is if they can't do that, that gets into a whole different criteria. So I have some special circumstances or some really more challenging situations that we're going to deal with after we get through the FAFSA, but I decided to put those at the end so we could really focus on those situations that are definitely a bit unique. So I'm going to go for the moment and assume that a student who's indicated that she is homeless can get that documentation from one of those three organizations that we just talked about. She will then see a screen like this, and her household size will be 1. So anytime that a student, whether they're in legal guardianship or they're homeless, they are going to see this screen. They're going to be considered independent, and most likely their household size is a household size of 1. So that student who's living with their grandparents, who's in legal guardianship, is going to answer yes. They're going to be considered independent, but their household size is going to be a household size of 1. So before we continue on with the assumption that for the purposes of today, the student could not answer yes to any of those 11 questions and is going to be considered a dependent student, have to provide parent information, do we have any questions about dependency status, Maria, that we should talk about right now?
Yeah, just an interesting thing came up about what happens when a student, you know, the tricky thing is they're like 22 or 23 and they live on their own in an apartment, you know, is parent information still required?
Unless they can answer yes to one of those questions, then yes, they are going to have to provide parent information. Now, after we do the FAFSA, so after that last section we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about students who might be in a situation where they're unable to provide parent information. So hold tight with me and we're going to talk about that piece at the end, but typically yes. So you are not automatically considered independent just because you're 22 and support yourself. That no longer is the case. It used to be way back in the day when I first started in financial aid, but it is not the case any longer.
Okay, and this is a question I wish we didn't have to answer, but it does happen. What happens if the applicant who is pregnant loses the child after the FAFSA process?
That is a question, you know, in 27 years, I don't think I've ever been asked that question.
I don't think I have either.
I can double check it, but I'm trying to think about when students get divorced. The FAFSA is a snapshot, and it's typically as of the day you file the FAFSA, what information is accurate. So I believe for that 1 year, the student would go through the process as being independent. Now the next year, unless they could answer yes to one of the other questions, they would be considered dependent. But I don't believe there's any requirement that the student has to follow back up unless they're selected for verification. Now, if they're selected for verification, I think that would come out in the verification process and they would need to provide information at that point in time. But I'm going to check on that. And I know I've got Jennifer Hutchinson on the phone and on the line on this webinar with us, excuse me. And so if Jennifer has a thought about that or any other financial aid people, if you've actually been asked that question and researched it, let me know.
Carrie Frechette said she thinks
Oh,
they are supposed to go in and update it back to being dependent.
okay. Okay. Well, let me do this. Let me research it. So I'm going to, oh, I see Martha Johnston has raised her hand. That's my boss. That's all. Do you all get nervous when your boss raises
Carrie
her
said
hand?
she would look too.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll research that and we'll get that out to you.
Okay.
Okay.
And
yeah,
just, yeah, I was going to say one more question too,
Mhm.
which is a good one. So this particular parent, they had legal guardianship of their granddaughter, and that legal guardianship dissolved when the daughter turned 18.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then what?
Because she was in legal guardianship as determined by a court in her state, she is considered independent. Yes, because at 18, she no longer is in legal guardianship anymore, but because she was at the age of 13 or later, she would answer yes to that question.
I just thought that was a good one to put out there.
Absolutely.
Other than that, I think we're going, Martha said it was a mouse malfunction.
Oh, okay. She's making sure I'm paying attention.
I'm calling her out.
Okay. All righty. All right. So let's move on. And now what you're going to see is you're going to see that we're kind of here in the parent demographic section. So we're about halfway through the FAFSA at this point. And so when we get to this page, this is always where we stop if we're doing an individual FAFSA with a family and we have a conversation about who makes up that family. And when you're thinking about this, we want you to throw out every definition of parents that you've ever heard, because the FAFSA has its own unique definition of who is a parent for the purposes of the FAFSA. So even though things like who claims a child on a tax return might seem to be a determining factor as to who is a parent on the FAFSA, it has nothing to do with it whatsoever. So here's how you determine who has to provide parent information. So I want you to think about, or I want the student to think about who her biological or adoptive parents are. And adoptive parents are the same as biological for the purposes of this. If that student, if her biological or adoptive parents are married to each other, she has to provide information about both of those parents. If her parents are not married to each other, but they live in the same household, and we see that, don't we, Maria? We did the other night. Then information about both parents still has to be provided, okay? So both biological or adoptive parents live in the same household, even if they're not married, both parents have to provide information on the FAFSA. But if it's a situation where the student's biological or adoptive parents are not married and do not live in the same household, then what the student needs to think about is who did I live with most over the last 12 months? Whichever parent the student lived with most over the last 12 months, that's the parent who has to provide financial information on the FAFSA. Now, believe it or not, the other parent doesn't need to provide any information, financial information on the FAFSA. So let's just say that the situation is that I'm the student, I live with my dad 60% of the time, I live with my mom 40% of the time. I have to provide dad's information on the FAFSA, but none of mom's financial information is required. But there is one more step to that, and that gets to the question that is asked here. As of today, what is the marital status of your parent? So once I've determined who my parent is for the purposes of the FAFSA, they want to know what is that parent's marital status as of today. So for that same scenario where I indicated that I live with dad 60% of the time, so he's my parent on the FAFSA, if he's currently married, if he got remarried, his spouse, my step-parent's information also has to be provided on the FAFSA. And people are usually not particularly excited about that, but that is the way that the FAFSA does need to be completed. So marital status is of the day the FAFSA is filed. There's no way around that. If you have questions, this is a great one to check on the question mark as you're working with a student, just to double check what the criteria is if there's any doubt about that. And of course, you can always reach out to us. And then assuming that you're married or remarried, or depending on how you answer that first question, you'll see a subsequent question. So then in this case, we're going to go through with the assumption that the parents are married to each other, okay, just for the sake of that, but I'll mention a few places where it might look different if that's not the scenario. But in this case, there's going to be two parents that will be providing information. So for the first parent, and that can be, mother, father, step parent, doesn't matter. A question we get a lot is, do we have to have parent one be this person who's first on the tax return? No, it does not matter at all. So whichever parent you want to be parent one can be parent one. So you're going to put in information about parent one. Next, you're going to put in information about parent two. And you will notice that they're making some progress. You know, they do talk about the parent rather than specifically the mother or father, because we certainly could have a situation where the student has two dads or two moms. And so if those parents are married, or they're both the biological parents and they live in the same household, then information about both of those individuals needs to be provided as well. Okay. Next, it's going to ask them how long they've lived in whatever state they indicated their residence is. And then they're going to complete the household size page here. Now, if the student was independent, they saw it immediately after they answered those dependency questions. If the student is dependent, they don't see it until after they provide parent information. And part of that is because in an attempt to be helpful, I think this page is still confusing, but in an attempt to be helpful, there's pre-filled information. So based on the fact that we said that parents were married or both biological parents lived in the same household, it's already put in 2. It's already going to list the student, because the student is always listed in the household size, even if they haven't lived at home for a couple of years. But then it's going to provide the opportunity to include other individuals. So if the parents have other children, they are going to include those children in the household if they provide more than half support. So it's a different criteria. It's, do they provide more than half support? So oftentimes, you know, if they're providing more than half support, it probably means the students are living with them. But it could even be a case, for example, where maybe a student lives with another parent, right? Let's say that there was a divorce. And so the student lives with one family, but the parent from the other family is actually providing a lot of the support. You're going to come back to that support question. They will include any children that they are providing more than half support for. Additionally, they're going to include any student who would be required to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So that's a pretty broad category there. So we want to be sure that you check on the question mark here if there's any doubt about who should be included in the household size. And then again, other people, if they provide more than half support, if the parents do, would be included as well. And then you are going to list the number in college. So then we get to tax filing status, and tax filing status is going to be fairly straightforward, where they're going to indicate if they've already completed their taxes. Now, because we're using 2019 income information, most families have already completed their taxes. We did have an extension until July, but most people have completed their taxes. This raises one of the most significant questions that we're getting this year is, what is the impact of COVID? We know that the impact is that it's meant that many families don't have the same income that they did in 2019, that for many families their income is less in 2020 and maybe less in 2021. And people are like, well, how come we're using 2019 income information? Well, the FAFSA does require that for this FAFSA that we're filing here, that 2019 income does have to be provided. And that's for everyone across the board. Now, there is the opportunity to adjust that, but the way that it is done is not by doing anything to the FAFSA. Instead, it's by contacting the financial aid office after the FAFSA has been processed and discussing your situation with them, basically doing a financial aid appeal. So we are certainly happy to talk about financial aid appeals. We've done sessions on them, and we've got a whole bunch of information that we can share with you if you have students that are in that circumstance. But for today, and for everyone that's completing the 21-22 FAFSA, they have to provide 2019 income information to start. So many people, as I was mentioning, have already completed their FAFSA, their taxes, but there is the possibility to indicate that they haven't yet, but they will. But then there's also the question that they don't have to file. So we have many people out there who aren't required to file taxes, and that's fine. If people aren't required to, many students aren't, and even some parents aren't required to file. So parents who don't have to file taxes don't need to be nervous about this. They're just going to indicate that they're not required to file the taxes. But if people are filing taxes, they're going to indicate what form. Typically, it's going to be an IRS 1040. The EZ and the A are gone, so virtually everyone's doing a 1040. But then this next question is very important, is what type of filing status are you? So married joint, so both parents, head of household, single. There are a couple of different tax filing status, and this is really important because this is going to determine in some cases whether people can use the IRS data retrieval tool.
Mila, can I jump in before you go on? Because it is slightly related. Just to back up for 1 second, there was a flurry of questions. But just address real fast, if you could, about 50-50 shared custody. There's a few things about what happens if it's totally equal, or who's, back to who's considered a parent for a moment.
Okay. Yes, no, absolutely. And jump in anytime. So 50-50. So I really think that in reality, it rarely is exactly 50-50. For a matter of fact, I would advocate that if families know that this is going to be the question on the FAFSA, they make a conscious decision where the student lives a little bit more, so that they can reside with one parent a little bit more than the other, and have that, work to their advantage, just like people have tax laws work to their advantage all the time. But if it's truly 50-50, we're sitting down with a family tonight, and so we're looking 12 months prior, and it's exactly 50-50, only then do we talk about who provided the most financial support. So if it's exactly 50-50, then the parent who provided more financial support, maybe health insurance and things like that, that would be the parent who has to provide financial information on the FAFSA. But that's only if it's exactly 50-50, which I think in reality is rarely the case. Does that take care of it, Maria? Okay. Anything else related before I?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
Everything else I think we're okay on, but just some clarifying questions on that. So thank you.
Okay, you bet. All right. So the IRS data retrieval is a tool that we love, because what it does is it provides the opportunity to take tax information, to get it directly from the IRS and retrieve it and put it into the FAFSA, all in the right place, all in the right location. But in order to be able to use the IRS data retrieval tool, some things have to be consistent. So for example, marital status, if it's married, you have to file a married joint tax return in order to use this particular tool. They're working on it. They've told us it's coming. But right now, if you had, let's say, those two parents who were not married to each other, but lived in the same households, we're providing parent information about two parents, and they both filed separate tax returns, there's no ability for the system currently to add those together. So another case where you might see that is, let's just say that someone got divorced and separated, but for 2019, they filed a married joint tax return. Because those statuses are inconsistent for the purposes of retrieving the tax information, they won't be able to use that tool. So if you don't see the student presented with this opportunity to use this tool, that's probably the reason why. Again, you can always reach out to us, and we can talk more about that and figure out the next steps, which probably just mean entering the information manually. But if presented to use the opportunity to use the IRS data retrieval tool, please do use it. And so what's going to happen if you click on it, it's going to tell you that you are going to link to the IRS. The parent will then need to put in their FSA ID. So this is going to be the first time that parents have to use their FSA ID, because again, we logged in using the student's FSA ID. So here, if I already have my FSA ID and I'm parent 2, I'm just going to click on parent 2, and I'm going to put in my username and password. If my husband was doing it, he would click parent 1 and he would put his in. Doesn't matter which parent, doesn't matter who's first on a tax return. Just make sure that you're being consistent about who parent 1 is when you did that demographic section for the parents. Now, another thing is, if you don't have an FSA ID yet, if you're the parent. So if the parent didn't realize they needed an FSA ID, they get to this point, they can simply click on Create My FSA ID right here. And it's going to take them out to that site that we showed you at the very beginning. They can get their FSA ID and they can come back and use it immediately. If they're one of those parents who may be an older sibling, created their FSA ID, and they have no idea what their username is or their password, they can click here. It will take them out to that site, and they can try to retrieve their username or reset their password. They might want to first watch our What the Heck is Up with My FSA ID video, because it might help clarify, what's going to happen and what that process is going to look like. But they can link right from there, okay? Now, whenever we're in a situation where they're going to go out and use go to the FSA ID site, I do like to make sure that people are saving things as they go. It should be happening automatically, but it's always a good idea, especially in this section, just to save and to be sure that it's been all saved. So once you put in the parent whose information you're providing and put in the FSA ID, then you're going to see this screen that's going to ask if you want to proceed to the website. You do want to go to the IRS site. It's going to give you your super serious warning, and then you're going to see this screen. Now, this here is where we're going to retrieve the tax information. In order to do that, they want to be sure that I'm really me and that everything matches up. So it's pulled over my name, my social security number, and my date of birth and my filing status from what I already provided on the FAFSA. So that's where it's getting that information from. But then what I have to do is I have to fill in my street address and my full address. This is super important that people have their tax return in front of them when they're doing this section, because it has to match exactly what was on the tax return. If it does not match exactly what was on the tax return, it's not going to find it. So it can be the littlest thing. For a matter of fact, I think it was Jennifer in our office, her accountant had misspelled something on their tax return, and in order to get the IRS data retrieval tool to work, she had to misspell it in the same way so that it could find it. So this is very persnickety. So that's why we want people to have their tax returns in front of them to make sure that they enter that information correctly. But assuming that they do and they hit submit, it's going to find their taxes. And it's going to say, this is the screen that makes us all so happy when we're working on FAFSAs with students. It's going to tell them everything that's been pulled over. Now, I do want to let you know that these are the fields that always come over. So even if these fields are 0, it's still going to pull them over. So every now and then a parent will say, well, I didn't have any untaxed portions of an IRA distribution, that, and they get all nervous because they think it's not accurate. In reality, it's just pulling that field. And if it's 0 in that field, it's going to transfer back to 0. So no reason to be concerned about that. They're going to click on the box here, and then they're going to transfer. And before they know it, they're back in the FAFSA. They're right back in the FAFSA, and what they're going to see is that their information has been transferred from the IRS. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that it doesn't show tax information. So it's only going to say transferred from the IRS. So they're not going to see that. So that is comforting. Some parents don't want their students to see their tax information, so they actually really like this. So that's always the way that it is when it's transferred. Now, if you have a situation where it was a married joint tax return, then you're going to see this question, because what this question wants to know is how much did each of the parents earn in wages. So if you think about a tax return, when you look at the wage question on a tax return, it's a lump sum. So when I file my taxes with my husband, our wages are combined together. That's fine for the purposes of taxes. But for the purposes of the FAFSA, it's important to know which parent earned what wages, because there's something built into the FAFSA that recognizes the fact that both parents work outside the home. There are extra expenses with that. So it takes that into account, which is a really, really good thing. So parents do need to separate out and put in their specific wages on this screen. And where they're going to find that's on their W-2. So if parents have their W-2 in front of them, that's the best thing to do, and it's going to tell you exactly where on the W-2 you can get that information. Then it's going to show tax information. Now on this particular slide here, it was manually entered, but if it came over from the IRS, it's still going to say transferred from the IRS. Next, you're going to see some questions related to tax filers. And so these questions would be answered typically by the IRS data retrieval if they had any of this information, okay? So this is usually pretty much going to be all updated by the IRS data retrieval tool. This section here is additional parent information, and this is confusing to people, so I thought I'd just provide just a little bit of background of what this is so that it makes sense. Here it's asking, for example, did the parent pay child support? And why it wants to know this is because if a parent has a certain amount of income, but they're paying child support, then the FAFSA wants to recognize, the formula wants to recognize that that money is not available to help pay for that student to go to college. If dad or mom is paying, $5,000 in child support, that $5,000 is not available to help this child go to college. So that wants to be excluded from the formula. Additionally, if you have, and this is on the parent side, but the same question is asked of the student, did you have work study earnings? The way that it works is if a student has work study, that they have to pay federal taxes on that, assuming that they are required to pay federal taxes. But when they file the FAFSA, they're going to list the amount of their work study, because their work study is not going to be counted when calculating their financial aid eligibility for the next year. So this slide is really about putting in information so that it can be excluded when calculating the EFC. So people who have this stuff want to be sure that they fill this in because it works to their advantage. And then they're going to see, in many cases, untaxed income. So there are cases where people receive money that doesn't show up on a tax return. That might be child support received, for example. The biggest one that we see most often is that a lot of individuals contribute to a tax-deferred pension or retirement plan. So for their income for 2019 specifically, they have to indicate if they took any of their 2019 income and they put it into a tax-deferred pension plan. Because what that means is they had that income, but it didn't show up on their tax return because it was pre-tax, okay? So any income they had in that year, they do have to list there. And again, they're gonna find that on the W-2. And then if they had any of these other items, they're gonna list those as well. And then last but not least, in the parent section, they're going to see asset questions. And so when it comes to filling out this section of the FAFSA, we want to start by making sure that people know that there are a lot of assets that are excluded from the FAFSA. So for example, things that are excluded in terms of assets are the primary residence. People do not include their primary residence when they're calculating their assets. That is completely off the table. They're also not going to include the value of a retirement plan. So that retirement plan that's sitting out there waiting for them, that's going to be excluded. Now, not to be confusing, I did just talk about contributing to a retirement plan, but that was income. That was income in 2019. What's excluded is the value of all of their retirement funds sitting out there waiting for them to retire. Additionally, they're going to exclude any small family-owned business with fewer than 100 full-time employees. So what's left to be counted as an asset? Cash, savings, checking, non-retirement investments, college savings plans, properties. If people had a camp, for example, they'd need to calculate the net worth of that, and that would count as an asset. So when they get to this section, they need to separate out which things count and which things don't. And I believe, Marie, you just dropped into the checklist that has a list of all of those assets. And I will, how those assets, whether they count or not, and I'll also include that in a follow-up email.
I do also want to pose a question since we're right there. We very early on, we got a question about if a person is self-employed, what is included as an asset?
Yeah, only their personal assets.
Correct.
Yes,
yeah.
Right. Business assets are not included here for this purpose. So what they're going to do is they're going to calculate their assets, and then they're going to look, and it says, as of this day, does the total amount of your current assets exceed $13,500? That is not going to be the same for everybody. That number is calculated based on the parent's age, the older parent's age, so in my case it's me, as well as the marital status. So based on that, it builds in an asset protection allowance. So a certain portion of our assets are protected. So only if our assets, in this particular case, exceeded $13,500 would we need to provide any additional asset information. If someone says, nope, I've got a couple $1,000s in my savings account, in my checking account, and that's all I have for accountable assets, then they would click no, and they would not have to provide any detail. If they do exceed that amount, then what they're going to do is they're going to list them in the particular category. So they'll see 3 additional questions. So one of the things that we see a lot here in Maine is that there is, again, skip logic built into the FAFSA, meaning that what you just saw are all of the possible questions that are going to be asked. But in reality, probably more families than not don't end up answering all of the questions, because there are actually 3 pathways within the FAFSA currently. There's the full question pathway, which we just took care of. But then there's this simplified pathway. And what this basically does is it says if your income was less than $50,000 per year, then they're going to be presented with this screen. The other pathway didn't see it, right? And it's going to basically say to them, it's going to ask them about whether or not they filed a Schedule 1, which is a page of a tax return, which lists some other additional information. The good news is this year, that's automatically being transferred over, the answer to that question, if you use the IRS data retrieval tool, okay? So it's going to ask them if they had a Schedule 1 under these circumstances. It's going to ask them if they were a dislocated worker, which we are now in another time frame. For years, we didn't have a lot of dislocated workers. Now we're back to having dislocated workers. And if you want a definition of that, you can click on that in the real FAFSA. Or did you receive any of the federally means tested programs? If you answer these questions, so that you had, for example, one of these federally means tested. So if you meet any of the criteria here, any of these 3 bites at the apple, then in reality, what the student would then see next, or what the parents would see next, is this question: do you want to skip your parent assets? So what the simplified pathway does is it says, okay, we've got your income and we know about your income, but based on your income and maybe the fact that you get, a federally means tested program like Main Care, we don't need to know about your assets. We're not going to count them. They don't matter to us. Your income is such that that's off the table completely. Okay, so that's pathway number 2. Then there's pathway number 3. And pathway number 3 is for people who earn less than $27,000. This is one of the changes to the FAFSA for this year. It used to be $26,000. Last year it was $26,000 was the cutoff. This year it's $27,000. So if people earn less than $27,000, and again, let's just say that they are getting SNAP, then they are going to be on the auto zero pathway. And look at what this one will do. After that question, this is going to come right after they've provided their income. They won't have even seen all those untaxed screens. It's going to come, many, many slides ago. They're going to see a question that says, do you want to skip the remaining questions about you and your parents' income and assets? So it's going to skip several parent questions about untaxed income and things like that. It's going to skip all the parent assets. And there isn't even going to be a student income section at all. The student will never know that there was a student financial section. Okay, it's going to skip that all together, and they're actually going to be at the very end of the FAFSA. So for those families who have fewer financial resources, filling out the FAFSA is even easier for them. So you're going to see different scenarios when you work with different students. So the student financial section would come next, but again, we're not going to go through that just because it's almost identical to the parent section. But we have a lot of students who never see that section because they're auto zeros. So next what they're going to see, and I'll take a quick break, Maria. Next what they're going to see is a summary of all of the information. They just want to review that and make sure that it's all accurate. And then all that's left is signing the FAFSA. If the student has already used their FSA ID, they do not need to enter it again. It's one of these things where they've made it smart enough to know that they've already used it. So the student will simply indicate that they want to provide their signature. They will have to read the terms and agree to them, basically that they've provided accurate information and that they'll use their money only for their higher education. And then they'll click next, and then they'll click on sign this FAFSA, okay? So it's literally 3 little clicks. And then on the parent side, they need to determine which parent is going to be signing the FAFSA on the student's behalf, parent 1 or parent 2. It does tell you the date of birth, so that helps in the end of the social, so you make sure you get the right one. If the same parent is going to sign the FAFSA that use the IRS data retrieval tool, it's going to be the same thing. They're not going to have to re-enter that information. Now, they might want to have the other parent sign, and that's fine. No problem with doing that. But if they've already used the IRS data retrieval tool, that FSA ID is already in there. And so if they haven't used the IRS data retrieval tool, let's just say their family doesn't file taxes. So parents never even had the opportunity to use the IRS data retrieval tool. They can get an FSA ID here. They can create one if they didn't have one, or if they've already created one, they're going to put in their username or verified email, and they're going to put in their password, and they're going to click on sign FAFSA. And then what you're going to see is that the student's electronically signed, the parent has electronically signed, and then they will submit their FAFSA. Simple as that. In reality, we're having students who, if they have their FSA IDs ahead of time, and especially if they're those auto zeros, they're done in 20 minutes. So it really does not have to be a process that is nearly as difficult as people think it is. If people have more than one child in college, what they can do is when they're on this page, but on this page only, they can click here and it will create a new FAFSA. And that new FAFSA, they would put in the other student's FSA ID information. And what they're going to find is once they move through the FAFSA and provide that student specific information, when they get to the parent section, it's going to be all filled out for them. So that's just a little way of making it even easier. But again, that link is only here on this page. So once they leave this page, they can't get back to it. So also on the confirmation page, they're going to see what their EFC is, and they're going to see which schools they requested to have their information sent to. After their FAFSA is filed, which typically takes 2 to 3 days, they say sometimes 3 to 5, but it rarely seems like it takes that long anymore. They will see that their FAFSA has been successfully processed, hopefully. So they will get an email, the student will, to give them a heads up that their FAFSA has been processed, but they can always come right back to FAFSA.gov and log back into FAFSA.gov with their FSA ID information. And when they see this, they will see that they can take a look at their student aid report, We want them to take a look at their student aid report and to make sure everything looks accurate. We also want them to take a look at their student aid report to see if they were selected for verification. This is going to be their first heads up if they've been selected for verification. In the student aid report, there's text that says right at the beginning if you've been selected, and additionally, if there's an asterisk, if you've ever seen an asterisk next to the EFC on a student aid report, that is an indication that that student has been selected for verification. Colleges themselves have to complete the verification process with the student. That's where the student's going to provide the information, but this will give them the heads up to be on the lookout for that. If they do need to make any corrections, they're going to click on Make FAFSA Corrections. If they need to add a different school or they realize they made a mistake, then they will come back here and go into the FAFSA and fix it. All right, so the last little segment we have is just to talk a little bit more about homelessness and some of those unique situations. Maria, do I need to take a break and answer a question first?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, we've had some things going on in the chat, but just to say that some of the FAFSA is 2019 information, so the tax information and all of that, but some of it is as of the day you're filing the FAFSA. So if parents have to provide asset information, it says as of today, what is the current value of your asset? So I just wanted to kind of make that clear because we talk about 2019 information a lot, but some of it is specific to the particular day that the student is filing the FAFSA.
Yeah, and actually virtually everything besides the income is as of the day the FAFSA is filed. So thanks for bringing that up and clarifying that, Maria. All right, so now I just want to talk a little bit more about students who might be dealing with homelessness. So let me start by reviewing the questions that we looked at when we were going through the dependency status initially. So the student, if they had not answered yes to any of the previous questions about dependency, they would see this question that we already talked about. On or after July 1st of 2020, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? If the student says yes, then they see these options. And if they can indicate that yes, one of these three people can verify that, then they're good to go. They're going to go through the rest of the process. They're going to be considered independent, and they just need to be on the lookout that the school might require documentation of that. But what happens if they say none of the above? So let's just say they're that 21-year-old, right? And so maybe in high school they were considered homeless, but their high school can't verify that now or document that now, and no one can. What do? Sorry, they are going to, sorry, I went in the wrong direction. They are then going to see this screen here. And so this screen here is going to verify or provide them with additional information to make sure that they're meeting that criteria. So one of the things we talk about is how is homelessness defined? And homelessness is at risk of, meaning that you do not have fixed, regular, adequate housing. So in some cases, students are couch surfing and they're staying with these friends for a couple of nights and then these friends. That is considered by the definition to be homeless, as well as all of those other circumstances there. There's also another key piece that is you have to be unaccompanied. So in order to be able to answer yes to this homeless question, the student needs to be unaccompanied. And what I mean by that is we might have a student who is indeed homeless, but that student is homeless with their parents. So maybe, you know, they're with their parents and their parents are, you know, living, you know, who knows where, but they meet that definition. But because they're with their parents, they're not considered unaccompanied. And that is key. They have to be unaccompanied in order to say yes to these questions, okay? If they're homeless and living with their parents, then their parents still do need to provide information on the FAFSA. Now, assuming that they're homeless, they probably are going to have a 0 EFC, but parent information is still required when a student is homeless if the student is not unaccompanied. If they're unaccompanied, then they do not have to provide any parent information on the FAFSA depending on these next steps. So it wants to make sure that the student understands exactly how these things are defined. So based on that, it lets them know, hey, if you don't provide parent information on the FAFSA, here's what's going to happen. No parent information is going to be transferred. You're not going to have a calculated EFC. You've got to follow up with your school. Basically, you don't have a valid FAFSA at that point in time. But if the student says, yeah, but that's my situation. I can't provide parent information because I'm homeless, I'm unaccompanied, and I meet this criteria, then the student would indeed indicate that. And then click next. They're going to provide their household size. It means they're going to be, you know, a household size of 1 under those circumstances. But the key piece is they then got to follow up with their college. And the financial aid office is who is going to make the determination of whether or not they meet that criteria. The financial aid office can make that decision as to whether the student is indeed homeless or at risk of being homeless, and if the student is unaccompanied. And the financial aid office can do that without documentation from other sources, although that's ideal. So if you're with an upward bound program or something like that and you're aware of the student's circumstances, that's always very helpful. But in those really, really difficult situations where there's no one that can attest to the student's situation, the financial aid office can actually sit down with that student and have a conversation, and based on that conversation can document that they meet that criteria. Yesterday in NASFA News, for any of you who, I know there's some financial aid people on here, and in another posting today, there was some great information, heartbreaking information, but really helpful information on homeless students. So I'm going to send you that in the follow-up, because it just talks about the fact that, you know, we have so many students that are in these difficult situations, and we really want and need them to get through and to get their educations. And with COVID, it's just even a more difficult hill to climb. So that we really want to be sure that they know they have options available to them. And even if no one can document their situation, they can have that conversation with the financial aid office. And the financial aid office is just simply supposed to verify whether or not they meet that definition, not why and how come. So I'm going to send some additional resources on that. Next, I want to just mention that if the student has special circumstances that are, the situation is that the student says, I cannot provide parent information on my FAFSA, so I couldn't answer yes to any of the dependency questions. So this is not a student who's homeless. This is a student who might be living with somebody else. So a very common one here might be a situation where the student is living with grandparents. And so they've been living with grandparents for years. They're not homeless. They have fixed, adequate housing, but they're not in legal guardianship. So they can't answer yes to the guardianship question. Technically, the student is still supposed to provide parent information on the FAFSA. And if the student can provide parent information on the FAFSA, that's what they need to do. So we have lots of students out there who are living with grandmother and grandfather, but mom is able to actually provide information on the FAFSA, and that's what's required. However, if it's a situation where parents, the biological or adoptive parents, cannot provide information on the FAFSA, that's when we have one of these special circumstances. And what might be the case there is perhaps the parents can't be found. Perhaps the parents are struggling with an addiction issue. Perhaps the student was being abused and left the household because it wasn't safe for them. Perhaps the parents are in prison. Those are what the financial aid world considers to be special circumstances. So in that situation, the student would talk with the financial aid office, and they need to theoretically talk with every office that they're applying to, but start with the one that they are most likely to want to attend and have a conversation about that. Following through with that case of the students living with their grandparents, let's just say that they're living with their grandparents because mom is nowhere to be found and dad maybe exists, but there's no relationship with dad, and let's just say, you know, dad is in prison. In that situation, the student is going to work with the financial aid office. They're going to have to document that situation. They're going to have to provide at least a couple of letters from non-family members to indicate that that's what their situation is. But they can go ahead and they can submit their FAFSA, okay? And when they submit their FAFSA, again, it's not going to be valid. They're going to have to follow up with the school and provide that documentation before they're going to be eligible to actually receive federal financial aid funds. But that's how those students in those difficult situations who can't answer yes to the dependency questions but cannot provide parent information, that's how they get through this FAFSA process. Now, I just want to be clear about what's not considered a special circumstance. So they used to include what was, and they've taken that out, and now they just list what's not. So not living with your parents is not a special circumstance. Not getting any financial support from your parents is not a special circumstance. Your parents not being willing to pay for college is not a special circumstance. Parents not claiming you on their tax return is not a special circumstance. And parents refusing to file the FAFSA is not a special circumstance. So if that's the student's situation, parent information is still required on the FAFSA. And we know there's an increasing number of parents out there who it seems like are unwilling to provide information on the FAFSA. So what we want to do at that point, and we're happy to be part of this conversation, if you ever think it would be helpful, is to let them know that just by providing information, they're not on the hook for anything. If they provide information on the FAFSA, they're not required to pay for any of the students' schooling. The school can't make them. They're not required to borrow a loan or anything like that. But by providing the information, they're just creating the opportunity for their student to be considered for federal financial aid funds, and state in the case of Maine as well. So it's really important that they do that, but we know we've got some out there that are still resisting that. In the case where they're resisting that and parents just say, no, we are not going to provide information on the FAFSA, but you don't meet any of those special circumstance criteria that we just talked about, then what they can do is they can go ahead, and again, same screens. These are, they're not ever going to see, they're not going to have all of these scenarios at once. So these are all, again, just kind of different pathways. They're going to see, again, the information about what happens if they don't provide parent information. But they are going to be told here that if you want to still submit a FAFSA, even though you don't have parent information, and by the regulations you're required to, you can do that. But the only thing you're going to be considered for is an unsubsidized loan up to your grade level amount, so $5,500 for a first-year student. So the student would go ahead, they'd say, I don't have special circumstances, but I am going to submit my FAFSA without parent information because I want to receive that unsubsidized loan. So they could go ahead and do that. There is one more step to that, though. The financial aid office is going to have to get a statement from the parent indicating that they refuse to fill out the FAFSA and that they are not providing any financial support to their student. But if they do that, the student can get the unsubsidized loan. All right, those are the situations which hopefully most of you aren't seeing too many of, but are the ones that are really, really difficult and where we get a lot of our questions. Maria, is there anything that came up while going through that wasn't clear that I need to clarify more or better?
Oh, ma'am, no questions, and you did a great job summarizing all of that.
Okay, thank you. So, last but not least, before we end today, give you a second more if you have any other questions for us, we want to let you know about our virtual FAFSA help sessions. So this year, we're not doing any group sessions in person because of COVID, but we are doing virtual help sessions. And how those work is people register for one, and they come to our event, which are at 6 o'clock on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights for the whole month of October. And we are going to do a brief presentation. We're going to just pick up a few of the high points that we talked about today, the most confusing questions that most families have. And then we're actually going to send them to their own breakout rooms. And so they will be alone in their breakout room with their, just their family, whatever device that they're on. And we will come behind the scenes. So FAME staff, and we've got volunteers as well, which we're very appreciative of. We will just come into a room, a breakout room. And so it'll just be the three of us, the student and the parent and us, or me, or whoever. And we can answer their individualized questions. It's private, it's personalized, and we have found that it's probably even more personalized in some ways because we're in their home and they're in our home. And we have found that families are really reacting positively to this and are just, like they often are when they do a FAFSA, like, oh my gosh, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But the level of support is really pretty cool. And we were not sure if it would work, but it's working. But here's the problem, guys. We're not getting great attendance. So will you please spread the word that for any of your students and families out there who need help with the FAFSA, even if they just want to come listen to the presentation part, even if they just want to come get help with their FSA ID, even if they just want us to check their FAFSA before they submit it, we're more than happy to do all of that. So we hope that you will share this link with them and have them sign up and come to some of our sessions.
And I'll add here that if there have been a number of folks that messaged us specifically as panelists with particular kind of sticky situations, and we absolutely want those people to register for the events as well. They'll get the individualized support, but if they really need a Sherpa to kind of guide them through and help, that's a great way for them to get free assistance with those particular situations. So a few of them I gave my direct email, but also registering for those events is a great idea in those cases.
Yes, and I didn't put my email on here, but I sent you an email today and I will follow up with one. So same thing, you can always, any of us, we're always happy to deal with those situations because those are the ones where people really need us, right? It's one thing if people are already going to be fine getting through the FAFSA. We love having them come too, but who we really, really want to see at these events are those families who are struggling and just don't know how to fill out the FAFSA. Sometimes what we find is when they realize that, oh my gosh, if I'm in legal guardianship, I'm independent, that the pathway becomes so much easier than they ever anticipated. And we can, you know, it's one of the things we love most, to be able to give them that peace of mind and help them get through this process. So please send them our way. All right. Anything else, Maria, before we end today?
Nothing really popped up for the whole group. So
okay.
We can wait a minute or two and see if anything pops in.
Okay.
But otherwise, all good.
Okay, well, normally what I would do here is we would have a slide about next month's Wednesday webinar, and we know that it's going to be on, financial wellness with students, something like that. But we are going to change the date because November 11th is a Wednesday this year. So knowing that many people will not be working that day, and that some schools won't be in session, or many schools won't be in session, we are going to have it on the 18th. So watch for that invite to come very soon. So I just wanted to share that as well. Righty. Well, if there's nothing more, then we will end for today. We will follow up with any questions that, if I think Maria's been, I can tell she's typing feverishly. But if there were any questions, I'll follow up with those, and we'll send you the additional materials that I mentioned. And thank you so much for being here with us today. We really, really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.